This is part 110 of jQuery tutorial. In this video, we'll discuss implementing ASP.NET generic handler that calls a stored procedure and return JSON data. In the previous video session, we have implemented the stored procedure spgetEmployees. The generic handler that we're going to implement now should call the stored procedure, retrieve the data, convert that to a JSON format, and then we want to display that JSON formatted data using jQuery Data Tables plugin, as you can see here. So for this to happen, the jQuery Data Tables plugin is going to issue a request to the server. In our case, it's going to issue the request to the handler that we are going to implement, and the request looks like this. Notice here the request is being made to a file with extension .ashx. So that's a handler, that's the ASP.NET handler. And notice we have got several query string parameters: display length, display start, sort column, sort direction, and search. So the generic handler that we are going to implement now should read the values from these query string parameters, call the stored procedure, provide those values, retrieve the data, convert that data to a JSON object. And the JSON object that we are going to send from the server back to jQuery Data Tables plugin should look like this. So it should be a well-formed JSON object with these properties: total records. So this property is going to specify the total number of rows that we have in the database table. Total display records. This property will also specify the total number of records, but after the filtering is applied. Data. This property is a two-dimensional array that contains the data that we want to display in the jQuery Data Tables plugin. If you look at the request here, look at that. The search query string parameter is equal to female, meaning we want to retrieve only the female employees. And if you look at the response here, notice that, look at the gender of each of the employee object that we have, it's female. Okay, and look at the total records, it's 14. So in the database table we have 14 records, and after the filter, that is, the search filter is applied, we only have 4 female records. So that's what this property specifies: total display records. Now the question that comes to our mind is, how do I know these are the names of the parameters and this is how the response should look like? That's from the jQuery Data Tables plugin documentation. So if you visit the URL right here, you have the documentation for performing server-side processing. So if you want to implement server-side processing, then these are the parameters that are sent to the server from the jQuery Data Tables plugin. So notice we have display start, display length, columns. So basically those are the query string parameters. As you can see in the request URL here, look at that: display length, display start, etc. So those are the parameter values that are sent to the server. Okay, and the reply from the server should be a well-formed JSON object with these properties: total records, total display records, and data. It's a two-dimensional array. Okay, so let's see how to implement that handler, which is going to read the values from the query string, call the stored procedure, retrieve the data, convert that to JSON format, and return that JSON formatted data so we can display that using jQuery Data Tables plugin. So let's flip to Visual Studio. The first thing that we want to do here is add a class file to our project, and I'm going to call this employee.cs, and this class is going to have an integer property. I'm going to call it ID, employee ID basically, and I'm going to have a property for first name. First name is going to be of type string. Similarly, we need for last name, gender, and job title. So let's change the property names. This is going to be last name, this is going to be gender, and this one is going to be job title. Alright, so we have the employee object. Now let's go ahead and add a generic handler. So we want to add a generic handler, and let's call this employee data handler. So we are going to write some ADO.NET code here. So I'm going to bring in the ADO.NET namespaces. We need system.configuration, we need system.data, we need system.data.sql client, and finally system.web.script.serialization. Alright, so within our process request function, we need to read the parameter values from the query strings, right? So for that we are going to use the context object, and if you look at the request here, look at that, iDisplayLength, iDisplayStart, those are the names of the parameters. So let's use the context object, context.requestOf. So what is the name of the parameter? iDisplayLength. So I'm going to copy that from the notepad to avoid any typos, and I'm going to store that in an integer variable. Look at the prefix for the property, it is iDisplayLength, so integer. So I'm going to store that in a variable. Let's call this variable displayLength of type integer, and we want to convert this to an integer, so I'm going to use in.parse function. So in.parse. Similarly, we need to read the other parameter values from the URL, and in the interest of time I have already typed the required code, so I'm going to copy this and paste it right here. So we are reading display start value, sort column, sort direction, and the search. Okay, so we have the values that we want to pass to the stored procedure. Now let's go ahead and read the connection string from our web.config file, and to do that we are going to make use of configuration manager class, configuration manager.connection strings of, and the name of the connection string is dbcs. And let's go ahead and create SQL connection object. Let's call it con equals new connection, and to this we have to pass the connection string. Now let's go ahead and create SQL command. Let's call it cmd equals new SQL command, and using this object we want to execute our stored procedure, and the name of the stored procedure is spgetEmployees. So let's pass the connection object that we have created above, and this is a stored procedure, so we have to tell that to the command object, command type dot stored procedure, and this command object has got several parameters. So let's go ahead and create a SQL parameter object. So I'm going to call this param display length equals new SQL parameter, and we need to specify parameter name. So display length parameter name in the stored procedure is at display length. So let's go ahead and specify that here, and the value for this parameter is coming from this variable. So we are reading from the URL, creating a SQL parameter object and specifying that here. So display length, and what do we need to do with this parameter object? We need to associate that with the command object. So command.parameters.add, let's pass the parameter display length. Now we need to do the same thing for the other parameters that we have, display start, sort column, sort direction, and search. In the interest of time I have already typed the required code, so let's copy all these parameter objects from the notepad and paste them right here. So we have all the parameters that are required for the stored procedure: display length, display start, and then we have sort column, sort direction, finally search. Okay, so we have associated all the parameters. Now let's open the connection.open, and then let's execute the command. So let's create an instance of SQL data reader and command.execute reader. Let's loop through each row using while loop. So while rdr.read, what do we want to do? We want to create an employee object and add that to the list of employees that we want to return. So at the top right here, outside of this using block, I'm actually going to create a variable of type list of employee, and let's call this list employees equals new list of employee. And here inside our while loop, let's create the employee object. Let's call it employee equals new employee. and we need to populate it properties employee.id equals, we need to read it from the reader, so rdr of the name of the column is id. Let's convert that to integer, so convert .twin32, and we need to do the same thing for the other properties of the employee object as well. Again, in the interest of time, I have actually typed the required code, so let's copy that from our notepad and paste it right here. So we are populating the rest of the properties of the employee object: first name, last name, gender, and job title. The next thing that we want to do is add it to the list. So list employees.add, pass our employee object, and that will be added to the list. Now look at this. When we execute this stored procedure, in addition to ID, first name, last name, gender, and job title, we are also getting the total count. So this is basically the count after the filter is applied. So if I don't specify any filter, we get all the rows, right? All 14 rows. Now if I apply a filter, look at this, female, then we get the filtered count. So that's 4, right? So we also want to read that filtered count. So what I'm going to do is, outside again this using block, I'm going to create a variable. I'm going to call this filtered count equals 0, initialize that, and then inside our while loop, where we are looping through each row, what I'm going to do is populate this property. So filtered count variable equals convert.toInt32 of, what is the name of the column here in the result set? Total count. So I'm going to specify that there, total count. Okay, so now by the time this loop finishes, we have the list of employee objects that we want to return. And keep in mind, how should the response look like? It should be a JSON object, and it should contain iTotal records, iTotal display records, A data. That's how the response should look like. So, and to avoid any typos, I have already typed them in the notepad right here. So what we are going to do is, once we have the list, so this is where we are closing the using block. So right here, let's create an instance of, actually before that we need to create a variable, and this is actually going to be the result that we want to serialize to JSON format. So this is going to be a new object. So I'm going to create an empty object here, and this is the object that is going to contain the properties that we want to return. So what are the properties that we want to return? iTotal records. So what is this property going to represent? The total number of records that we have in the DB. So the total rows that we have in the DB are, I think, 14, right? So we want to retrieve that total, right? So if you look at the count here on the right hand side, it's 14 rows. Now to retrieve that, I'm actually going to write a small private function. So this is going to return integer get, let's call this employee total count, and again here we are going to write some ADO.NET code just to save some time in typing. Let's copy these lines from here, actually even this, and paste it within our private function, and then we'll modify it according to our need. Okay, so configuration manager, we need to read the connection string, and let's create the SQL connection object. SQL command, this time it's not going to be a stored procedure, so we want to retrieve the total count from the table. So I'm going to use select count of star from TBL employee. So that's the query that we want to execute, and this is not a stored procedure, so we can get rid of that. And I'm going to create a variable here, and let's call this total employee count equals 0, and we need to open the connection, so let's go ahead and do that. And command dot, since we are getting a single value from the DB, we can use execute scalar, and total employee count equals that result, and we need to typecast that to integer. Okay, so we have the result variable. All we need to do is return that total employee count. Okay, so this function is going to give us the count of total employees, and we want to set that as the value for this property. So we are going to return an object which is going to contain I total records, and the value for that is going to be the return value of this get employee total count. And the next property we want is I total display records. And where are we going to get the value for that? That is going to come from this variable right here, filtered count, because I total display records represent the total number of rows that we have in the DB after the filters are applied. So that's filtered count. And then the third property that we want to have is A data. So A data equals, that's nothing but our list of employees that we want to return. So I'm going to specify that as the value. So now we have our result object. Now let us go ahead and create an instance of JavaScript serializer class. Let's call it JS equals new JavaScript serializer, and then JS dot serialize function, and let's pass our result object to that. Okay, and let's write it to the response stream. So we're going to use the context object dot response dot write the JSON response. Alright, so we have our handler implemented. So let us go ahead and build our solution, and let's view that in the browser. So let's run this. So when it first loads, it's actually going to throw an error because we need to supply the values for employee data handler. Look at this. When we issue a request to employee data handler.ashx, it's going to throw a runtime error because look at that, it's trying to read the value from the query string, but we don't have any query string parameter there. So that's why when it is trying to convert that to integer, a null value, it throws an exception. So this is how our URL should look like. Let me paste that here, and actually we have a different port number here, so let's copy the URL from there. We only want the query strings. So if you look at the URL right now, look at that, we have display length for this query string parameter. We have display start, sort column, sort direction, and search. And for now, let's remove search. Okay, run that. So now we should get the response from the server, and so basically it says invalid table name TBL employee because our table name is TBL employees. So let's go ahead and change that there, and let's reload this one more time. So now we get, look at this, if you look at the output here, notice that we get all the records, the total records of 14 and total display records of 14 because no filters are applied. So it's going to return us all the rows, and we have 14 rows here. Now let's go ahead and specify the other parameter. So the search parameter is sSearch, right? Let's confirm that from the jQuery data tables documentation. So the global search field is sSearch. So let's copy that to avoid any typos. sSearch equals, let's specify that as female. So now it should only retrieve the female employee rows. And look at that, the total records in the database are 14, but the total display records, that is after the filters are applied, it's only 4, and what we get back is only those female employees. Notice the gender there. Now in our next video, we'll discuss how to display this JSON data using jQuery Data Tables plugin. Thank you for listening and have a great day.